Hello, I'm Bryan Glick. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of Computer Weekly. I'm sure your organisation is probably like many others in that it's facing an increasing barrage of regulations with which you have to comply and also demonstrate to the world and to regulators that you comply with those regulations. Now, in few places is this more true than if you're a cybersecurity leader with a growing number of governments and regulators putting in place regulations to make sure that organisations are using best practice when it comes to being resilient, safe, secure against increasingly sophisticated cyber attacks. But let's be honest, there's a bit of a mismatch here, isn't there? Talk to many of your employees and I'll say to them, what do you think about complying with security regulations? And they'll sort of probably say, yeah, it's a bit of a tick box exercise. I get my security training and I do it and it's done and it's gone. Now that mismatch is important and it's a danger. What can we do about that? Especially as we're getting ever more regulation in the cybersecurity area. Even just recently in Europe, the European Union's Digital Operational Resilience Act, or DORA, as you'll hear us refer to it, it is another important part of the cybersecurity compliance regime. To try and find out how we can make compliance and security become more integrated and make compliance feel like more of an essential part of protecting your organisation, I'm joined by Richard Meeus. Richard is the Director of Security Technology and Strategy in Europe, Middle East and Africa for Akamai. Richard, welcome. Thanks for coming along to join us today.
Thank you very much, Bryan.
So let's start with the basics, Richard. Why should organisations think of compliance as more than just a tick box exercise?
Compliance, regulation, it's something that we've sort of seen a lot of in Europe and the EU, and the EU definitely loves regulation. But I think that when we actually look back historically of how regulation has been used, it has driven good results. Much as it seemed as a pain when it's originally put in place, GDPR was a great example of this. I think in the days of GDPR, when that was put in place, we knew what the risks were about working with personal data. We knew that sticking a million usernames and passwords in an unsecured S3 bucket was a bad idea, but people still did it. And therefore, we needed to put some regulation there to say, okay, let's just raise the bar on this. So it created that sort of minimum level, and we still get breaches today. We still get breaches. But I think if you think about what it would be like if we didn't have something like GDPR in place, if we didn't have those controls in place, how much worse could it possibly be? We'd still be having those unsecured buckets. We'd still be having that data in an unsecure manner. The risk could be, and the net result could be far, far worse.
You're very true about anybody in the European Union is very used to regulations coming through, but obviously these are regulations that affect organisations worldwide if they're looking to trade in the EU as well. And this recently introduced regulation called DORA, it's been a big topic of conversation, obviously across the security world. It's early days, but let's use that as an example. What impact are you seeing that DORA is already having on how organisations approach their cybersecurity?
We talk to a lot of financial services organisations about how they're addressing it, and many are in sort of we can address a lot of the requirements of DORA through our native tooling and the processes that we have. But what they're figuring out is there's an awful lot of work on top of that. So I think what it's really driving now is that organisations need to be efficient. They need to be able to understand their assets, their data flows, their tools. They need to be able to get visibility into their estates. One of the things I think DORA has highlighted a lot of is that organizations don't know what they have in their estates, at least not 100% or even 95%. So I think what it's helping to do is get organizations ensuring that they have the tooling to give the visibility into their assets, to understanding their data flow, understanding their critical assets. What is it they need to be operationally online all the time? What are the bits that they can almost lose in a way, and what are the bits that are critical? And I think this understanding of their assets and how it all fits together is becoming critical. And then also the automation around having to deal with you've got more visibility, you've got more alerts, you've got more tooling. You can create automation around that to manage that influx of data. This means that your security teams only need to act on what they actually have. They only need to act on what is really important.
Okay. So great to hear that you're seeing evidence that it's, some of these regulations are increasing efficiency, keeping people focused on some of the key issues around cybersecurity. One of the concerns that I often hear from organisations say, yes, we'll increase our focus, we'll increase our compliance, we'll meet DORA, NIS2, GDPR, all these other things. But it makes it really difficult for us to innovate because we're existing within this wall of compliance that makes it difficult for us to try and do new things. Is there a way that people could look at some of these regulations and use them to drive innovation rather than perceiving them as being something that restricts innovation?
Absolutely. I think everybody sort of thinks of sort of regulation and compliance as speed limits on the motorway. It's just like you can't go more than 70 miles an hour or 90 kilometers an hour or whatever it is. And that's restricting you. It's not. In the way that we want to be able to see security and compliance as a way of sort of enabling you to put in tools and controls that allow you to operate better. PCI is a good example of this. It looks at your whole software development life cycle. And when you actually look at the software development life cycle, say, for example, for APIs, and you look at how much it costs to fix a bug in a production piece of code compared to fixing it in development, it's an order of magnitude higher, like several hundred times higher. So what that is trying to do is say, spend the effort, fix it in development, because if you fix it in development, you're going to save a chunk of cost further on. And it really sort of tries to get organizations to focus on the idea of getting quality code at the edge. If you can try and get the quality code at the edge, you're going to be more efficient, you're going to be more effective, and you're going to save a lot of money because you're not having to do all of that sort of refactoring, repurposing, and redevelopment when it's hit production.
So there's a strong case to be made that regulations can help improve innovation. There's obviously a strong case to be made that that compliance can improve your organizational security and make you more effective. Let's step back from the individual regulations themselves for a moment. There are still data breaches. At Computer Weekly, we're writing about them all the time, unfortunately. Seeing organisations who are suffering from cyber attacks and it's having pretty significant effects on their operations, regardless of how good they are at complying with all these regulations. There's this term that's increasingly used these days, cyber resilience, being able to withstand these increasingly sophisticated cyber threats that organisations are facing. What does cyber resilience really mean today in this sort of environment where there are so many threats that you're facing? And where does compliance fit into that?
I've been using a quote, an inspirational quote for a while now, which I think sort of aligns really nicely to this. And I'd like to say it's from a great philosopher, but it's actually from a Rocky film. But I think it worked really, really well. So in the first Rocky film, there's a scene where Sylvester Stallone's talking to an up-and-coming boxer, and he says, "It ain't about how hard you hit. It's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward." And I think that's what cyber resilience is in a weird sort of way. It's you're going to get hit. You're going to get breached. It's going to happen. And you need to sort of assume that that process is going to happen. And therefore, you need to be able to build your assets, your security, your resilience tooling in such a way that you can take the punches. If you get breached, or more importantly, when you get breached, what are you going to do? What tools have you got in place to be able to say, I can take a breach, but I can make it a trivial event because I'm going to put the tooling in place to ensure that it's a relatively small event and it doesn't impact the rest of the business. And I think this is where the concept of understanding where the punches are going to come from and then understanding how you're going to deal with it. The concept of assumed breach is something we've been talking about for a while now across the industry. And I think it's really important because it's taking away that concept of what are we going to do after the breach. It's thinking, okay, we're breached now. What would we have to do to stop something happening, to stop it getting into our core systems? And doing that and giving you that sort of that thought process now allows you to start putting in the preventative measures that you need. And a lot of this aligns with a lot of the regulation and compliance that's coming through.
I love the analogy. I'm sure plenty of cybersecurity leaders would love to compare themselves with Rocky. But from a regulator's perspective, perhaps, yes, obviously regulators want to know that organisations can take the punches, but they also want organisations to be able to demonstrate and show that they can take the punches. You have to be able to demonstrate that you are complying as well. That again potentially leads to an attitude from organisations that, yeah, we've kept the regulator happy. How as a business can you demonstrate that your security controls, they aren't just there, you're not just ticking the boxes, but they are genuinely being effective within your organisation?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of discussion about what is the best way of doing this, because obviously, yes, the regulator is happy. That's great, but you want to be better than that. You want to be able to sort of prove to your board and to your investors and to your customers that you're available as 100% of the time as an aspirational goal. And I think looking at some of the regulations that go through, they're pushing towards things like threat-led penetration testing, aligning that to common frameworks such as the MITRE framework, so you can sort of say, okay, how does that framework align to my risk profile with the assets that I'm presenting to the internet, with the assets that I'm presenting to third parties? How can I align that and say, okay, we have tools in place that protect against this particular threat? And we've had it tested. We've had our red team come in and they've gone through and they haven't been able to get in, or we've used a purple combination where the red and blue teams are working together to be able to fix any gaps on the fly. I think doing things like that certainly help to give that confidence within the estate that it's not just a tick box, that you've gone through the process and you're able to sort of elevate your security to a level where you can almost sort of, not guarantee, but you're in a far better position to offer that sort of aspirational goal of 100% availability.
So you've talked, Richard, about the benefits to security of effective compliance and the benefits of effective compliance to security. It works both ways. Let me take you back to your earlier Rocky analogy. We've talked a lot about being able to take the punches. Obviously, a big element as well is being able to not get punched in the first place. And when you're talking about areas like risk management, it's about being proactive. It's about having plans in place to stop cyber breaches from happening in the first place, not just reacting and having plans in place to what to do if you are breached. What are the most effective strategies that you're seeing today that help organisations avoid the punches rather than just roll with the punches?
There's going to be aspects of you're going to get punched. So you need to put in tooling that is going to absorb those punches. So either putting in effective DDoS level protection to ensure that you can always remain online. But there's also parts about what happens if the attackers get inside your network, compromise your network. And I think a lot of organizations are now focused on what are their core assets? What do they need to keep their business operational? And there's a bit of a focus around like minimum viable company concept of, if you take everything, all of the ancillary stuff out, what is it you need to do the core assets and keep that running? And I think where we've seen a lot of focus around that is around things like microsegmentation, because that's a really good tool where you can literally lock down your core assets, your core tools that you need, your core databases, and sort of have like a ring of steel around that. So it really reduces the risk to that as much as possible. And that's a relatively easy way of being able to give yourself that sort of a degree of confidence in the terms of, okay, well, nobody can get into that bit. So therefore, you're then able to think about, okay, well, how can I optimize? How can I have a plan B for other assets, other tooling? And one of the things we're seeing organizations look to is more distributed components, of being able to use distributed compute, for example, to push as much of the elements to the edge. So therefore that there's less data that's being processed actually at the core, and therefore if there is a breach, there's less chance of that being exposed.
Okay. Let me, if I may, try and start to wrap some of this up. You've covered a lot of areas today, and thank you for that. We've talked about compliance and the importance of compliance, obviously effectiveness, resilience, innovation, the importance of being proactive. There's a lot for people to consider here. For somebody who's watching us having this discussion now, who's thinking, yeah, we need to get better at all of this. If you had one piece of advice for a security leader who's looking to balance all of these elements that you've talked about together into a really effective cybersecurity strategy, what would that one piece of advice be?
Trying to bring the security, the compliance, the resilience all together is not the terrifying sort of mountain that it sometimes appears to be. I think when we want to look at that challenge, it can be achieved by utilizing the relevant tooling, but I think a lot of the time it comes down to asking the right questions. You need to do what if strategies, really sort of going through what if this happens, what if this happens, be creative, just saying what happens if we have a massive power outage, what happens if there is an earthquake, what happens if the cyber attackers do get in but take down the telcos, what happened, and really sort of going through them all, because it might not happen, but the net result of what will happen could impact you, and therefore you have a plan to adopt on that. And I think really going through that what if scenario really helps people focus the attention, because you'll find then where are your key assets, what has to keep on running to keep your customers happy. And I think that's probably the most important thing I would think of.
Yeah, I think that's a great piece of advice. Just that very simple, straightforward, what if repetitive process is something that's incredibly effective, I think, for helping people with their planning. And hopefully will help them to get this balance right between cyber resilience, cybersecurity, and regulatory compliance. Richard Meeus from Akamai, thank you so much for coming along and sharing some of your experiences and insights into this really important topic.
Thank you very much, Bryan.
That's all we've got time for in this video now. Hope you've been able to take away some helpful, useful tips about how you can improve the balance between regulatory compliance and cyber resilience and cyber security in your organization. Thanks for watching.